Welcome to today's 23rd NEXUS Gains Talks webinar on the very important topic of integrated water resources management for water, energy, and food security in the Eastern Nile Basin. With growing impacts from climate change and extreme events on water, energy, and food security, as well as ecosystem health, we really need to double down on better management of water resources. Integrated assessment models are increasingly called upon to assess these, not only the hydrological impacts from climate change and other stressors, but also the economy-wide impacts of management strategies for key human development indicators, such as income, employment, water, energy, and food security. However, these modeling tools on their own might not be sufficient to, gather trust, ensure collaboration, and really get us on the path to a more climate and water resilient future. The CGIAR research initiative on NEXUS Gains works at this critical junction of trying to improve modeling tools, but also trying to work with stakeholders and key actor groups to develop those paths to water security and food security, energy security, and environmental health without reducing, without creating negative feedback effects and by strengthening positive feedback effects. Nowhere else, or almost nowhere else, is it more important to work on these topics than in the Eastern Nile Basin, which is a critical the Nile is a critical water resource for this region, but it also has contributed to tension and to challenges. And so today we hear from two eminent speakers who will discuss modeling and other approaches to address the challenges that we see in the Eastern Nile Basin. And we also hear from two eminent discussants who will bring in their own voices and views in support of those presentations, and also in support of all the work that they have been doing over the last decades for water, energy, food security, and ecosystem health in the Nile Basin. Following the two presentations and the two discussants, we will delve into what I hope will be a stimulating and enriching Q&A. With no further ado, I would like to now introduce our first speaker, Mohammed Bashir. He is a newly minted assistant professor at the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering of the University of Toronto. He has also spent time as Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at Humboldt University of Berlin. In addition, he has spent time at Cologne University, University of Manchester, and of course, he has also worked and taught in Sudan. His presentation is titled Towards an Integrated Approach to Dam Impact Assessment in the Eastern Nile. Professor Bashir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you for having me today. Great pleasure to present here. I hope you're seeing my slides now. So today's talk is part of work that we've done within the NEXUS Gains initiative. And here I have the contributors to this work. And what we try to do here is to develop an analytical approach that enables a more holistic way to assessing the impacts of dams in the Eastern Nile. So just quick geography information here about the Nile. I'm pretty sure many of you already know this information. It has three main tributaries. There is the White Nile here, coming from Lake Victoria, the Blue Nile from the Ethiopian highlands, and then the Adbara River from the Ethiopian highlands as well. The contributions of each of these rivers is, so the White Nile, 27%, the Blue Nile, 60%, and the Adbara River around 13% on average. The Nile Basin is quite significant. It has an area that covers about 10% of the land surface on Africa, 11 riparian countries, and over 500 million people living in the countries that share the Nile. The Nile, the river is under high stress in terms of water use. and requires careful management approaches to be able to assess the impacts of different interventions. Now, in 2011, the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam started here near the Ethiopia-Sudan border, and it has a hydropower capacity of around 5,150 megawatts, and construction is nearly completed now. There's one last phase of the filling of the reservoir of the dam, and once completed, it will double the overall amount of energy generation in Ethiopia, and hopefully increase the energy supply in the country. However, the dam has created tensions due to its anticipated impacts on Sudan and Egypt. And what we've tried to do here in this project is to look at various kinds of impacts on Sudan and try to bring them together in one simulation framework. So if we look at the impacts of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on Sudan, which is abbreviated as GERD, it provides a lot of opportunities to Sudan in terms of regulating the flow of the river, which can increase hydropower generation from dams in Sudan, so Sinai and Merwi dams. It provides flood control services because the flow becomes more regular. And it provides more reliable irrigation and food security due to the river flow regulation effect. There are other impacts that are not listed here. This is not a comprehensive list. For example, the reduction of reservoir sedimentation and the need for maintenance and so on. On the other hand, there are also risks, and these can be in terms of loss of recession agriculture. So this is a kind of flooding agriculture practiced along the banks of the Blue Nile and the Main Nile. There's going to be a loss of traditional fired clay brick production. I'm going to explain what this is in the next slide, because it's not a common kind of industry that you see in every country. There's also an anticipated impact in terms of land fertility because of the sediment trapping effect of the dam. You'll have less natural fertility downstream. There are other environmental impacts that are also expected. In terms of impacts on the river ecosystem, the fish and the movement of nutrients and so on. And there are other impacts that are not listed here. So what we try to do in this study is to capture as many of these impacts as possible in an analytical framework that enable us to look overall at the holistic impact of the dam in Sudan. Of course, it's pretty difficult to capture all of these impacts due to data issues. So the boxes that you see here that have a thick red outline, these are the impact that we could capture based on the data that we could gather. So we looked at hydropower, flood control, irrigation, and the impact on traditional fire clay brick production. So what's that? What's traditional fire clay brick production? It's producing brick based on the sediment that the river brings. So this kind of industry is practiced based on the annual natural flooding of the Blue Nile. And it's practiced in various parts of Sudan, but the majority of the production is along the Blue Nile and the Main Nile. 92% to be particular of traditional fire clay brick production is produced along the Blue Nile and the Main Nile. And this is based on the natural annual cycle of the river, where it brings sediments during the flood season that settle on the floodplains, and then these sediments are used to produce brick. And these are the steps in brick production, from mixing the sediment to molding it, to drying it, to firing it, cooling it, and then shipping it. So the dam is going to largely impact the production of traditional fire clay brick in Sudan. So how did we attempt to assess these impacts? We relied on 3 types of models. We built a river system model, and this is the kind of model in which you can simulate dams and their impacts on river flows and the agriculture and hydropower and so on. So from this model, it was developed using a tool called IWRM, Python Water Resources. It's an open source tool. So from this model, we could estimate how water supply and hydropower generation are expected to change. Then we took the flows that were generated from that simulation model. We built a 2-dimensional flood model to be able to estimate the impact in terms of flood control. And we use HECRAS, and we relied largely on open access data. From the impact on the flow and the flooding extent, we could infer how traditional fire clay brick production is going to be impacted. And in this case, we assume that the production along the Blue Nile and the Main Nile are going to be eliminated. Then from the flooding model, we could also estimate the impact on built-up areas. So with the Ethiopian dam, of course, less built-up areas are going to be flooded every year. We took all of these shocks, we put them into an economy-wide model to be able to come up with an overall idea about the impact. And so shocking all of these together into the economy of Sudan, this is a computable general equilibrium model based on the standard model of IFPRI. And from that, we could estimate the socioeconomic impacts on multiple sectors. So this is another view of how the models look like. So this is the river system model. It's a network of nodes and links that simulate the operating rules of dams and the demands of water. This is the hydrodynamic model, and what you see here is an animation based on one simulated day without the GERS. So when the flooding is still pretty high, and we can see that it can simulate the flood extent, the flood depth, and so on. And then we overlay that with a layer of built-up areas to be able to estimate the reduction in terms of built-up area flooding. Then we took all the shocks, we put them into a CGE model, which is a model that represents different actors within an economy and their interactions with each other, and also the interactions of industries. So in terms of the biophysical impacts of the dam on Sudan, we looked at three scenarios. One scenario in which the flow is high, another scenario in which the flow is average, median, and then in a low flow scenario. And we can see that hydropower in Sudan is going to be positively affected from 10% in the high scenario. In the median scenario, that's when we're going to have the most positive impact, almost around 17% increase. And the lowest scenario, the impact is going to be rather lower. In terms of impact on existing irrigation, that's going to be pretty mild, and the reason is because there is the Roseras Dam, which has been recently heightened and has a capacity already to supply sufficient water to existing irrigation in Sudan. But again, of course, the GERD is going to be able to support more expansion of irrigation in Sudan. In terms of flood control, when we look at the entire built-up area in Sudan, we can see that less areas are going to be inundated, ranging from 1% to nearly 2.5% between the highest and lowest scenarios. And in terms of brick production, the entire brick production along the Blue Nile and Main Nile have been eliminated. So if you look at the impacts on the economy, after we took these biophysical impacts, we put them into the economy model, we can see the impacts on various aggregate sectors. These are really aggregate sectors. Within them, there are many sectors. In the economy model, we have 70 production sectors, and we just aggregated them into these categories to be able to communicate this better. So we can see that services, manufacturing, and agriculture are going to have a positive impact. Industry will have negative impact under certain scenarios, and this is because of the reduction in traditional fire clay brick production, but at the same time because the increase in hydropower is rather low. And there's these two scenarios. With the median scenario, when you have higher hydropower increase, the increase in hydropower offsets the reduction in brick production. But then overall, if we look at the GDP, things kind of balance each other out. The highest impact on GDP is quite mild, around 0.1%. So we can see that impacts kind of balance each other out. And these results are based on simulating the 2025 economy. We can also look at the distributional impacts, and we have the impacts on the equivalent variation, the welfare of households, rural and urban households. These heat maps here, these are the different household groups and the different scenarios. And we can see that the impacts are mostly positive in terms of impacts, but urban households benefit more than rural households. So in conclusion, we need to have broad frameworks of potential impacts for large dams. We need to incorporate as many impacts as we can. And what we did here is just a start. We're planning to further expand this and include more impacts. We need policies, institutions, and technologies to be able to reduce the negative impacts on some populations, because even within these household groups, there are, if we look further, of course, there will be winners and losers within these household groups, and we need ways to mitigate their negative impacts. We need additional analysis to consider the impact that we did not cover on this model. And we should always remember that models have uncertainties, and these results just give us indications about the direction of potential impacts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Bashir. I think it's really an incredible set of modeling tools that you have brought together, hydrodynamic models and CGE models. I think it's a very unique approach, and I'm sure we will have a great discussion and questions around that in the Q&A section. And as a reminder, please add your questions to the Q&A box. We now come to our second presenter, Magdalena Messey. So she's currently a PhD student in Earth Systems Science at Florida International University. Magdalena has also spent time at the Eastern Nile Technical Regional Office, which is, an entity of the Nile Basin Initiative. So I think very important for managing Nile water resources, and of course, an important audience, I think, for this event today. She has also spent time at Twente and at Wageningen universities, and has also been very active at Ethiopian universities. And she will now discuss a topic I think that's very complementary to Professor Bashir's talk, focusing on requisite conditions for nexus gains in the Nile Basin. So over to you, Magdalena, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you again for the introduction. I'm a PhD researcher working on, so my PhD research is generally around developing adaptive water use management for the Nile Basin, which is pretty closely related to capitalizing on nexus gains. But what I want to contribute to this discussion is, I knew Dr. Bashir was going to go into the technical details. So my approach was to try and put in the socio-political aspect of nexus gains and what we need, requisite conditions, what I think are requisite conditions that we need to realize nexus gains in the Nile Basin. So I don't think there's a problem making the case for the Nile Basin, especially in the context of the Nile Basin, where we are faced with limited resources, increasing population, a very big growing question of equity, and the lack of a shared and agreed upon governance regime on transboundary water, pushing countries to pursue myopic endeavors, which end up being environmentally and also technically unsustainable. On top of that, we have climate change impacts to deal with, and then there's always the bigger agenda of achieving the SDG goals by 2030, while still being within the safe playing fields of the environmental, the planetary boundaries. So this is already a convoluted question. This is a very big ask, which presents a wicked problem at hand. And wicked problems are rarely solved without taking the systems thinking approach, right? So without capitalizing on the interlinkages of the systems, the interdependencies, the feedbacks, and without capitalizing on the trade-offs and also the trade-offs and the synergies among the systems. And this is why the nexus approach becomes a very positive thing when it comes to dealing with wicked problems in water management. These are characterizing traits of the nexus approach. The nexus approach, or the nexus thinking, takes on a systems thinking point of view and identifies the interdependencies, linkages, and feedbacks of different systems that are integrated, that are within these problems, and it capitalizes on the feedbacks and trade-offs to maximize benefits by capitalizing on efficiency, increasing productivity. And because we take this high-level holistic systems thinking approach, we also have the capacity to minimize unforeseen or unintended consequences. And that also allows us to build adaptability in the system, which is what we need when we're trying to address uncertainties and wicked problems as well. And particularly for basins such as the Nile Basin, where equity is a big question, the nexus can allow us, in addition to answering the big question of sustainability, if we reframe how we view equity, a nexus approach can also be a way to ensure equity. So it's a no-brainer that the nexus is the way to go. And you can also see how this approach is accepted worldwide, at least in academia, by the number of publications. We have more than 2,700 publications online since the year 2000 alone, and more than 100 publications just in the Nile. So if you look up NEXUS water management, and then now we have more than 100 publications. But one important thing that was actually raised by the webinar series, CGIAR's webinar series, the same webinar series, is that the NEXUS approach or publications on NEXUS approach are still to a large extent theoretical. There aren't many practical examples of NEXUS approach out there. So right now, as things stand, we are presenting the NEXUS approach as a possible theoretical framework to solve the wicked problems at hand. But the NEXUS approach is a different way of viewing problems and also our management approaches. So it needs a paradigm shift in how we work and how we think about water, right? So there are requisite conditions necessary that need to be in place for the NEXUS gains to be realized in the first place. And in the case of the Nile Basin, that requires a significant shift in the way we think and the way we work. So here, I like to bring in a framework that I really like, the theory of change principle, or the framework of theory of change. So what the theory of change actually does is it tries to see how and why a certain change can happen in a certain context, and it tries to work the how of how a change can happen in a certain context by first identifying and clarifying the big goal and trying to sort of working backwards to map out the intermediate steps that would allow us to help realize that big goal. So I'd like us to take this theory of change approach and roughly think about what would be the big goal of NEXUS in the Nile Basin, and then try to think backwards or map out the intermediate requisite steps necessary. So the first requisite, in my opinion, that's necessary is agreeing on the big goal. What is the big goal of the NEXUS approach when it comes to the Nile Basin? Is it ensuring equity? Is it ensuring sustainable long-term water use? Is it both? Is it ensuring that all Nile Basin citizens can have their water, energy, and food demands met by a certain year or up to a certain year? These are really big goals, and already agreeing on the big goal of the NEXUS for the Nile Basin is a pretty big ask because of the entrenched ways of thinking about water. Case in point being the CFA, right? So there's a very intrinsic, there's a very tense positionalities when it comes to ensuring water security for all basin countries versus ensuring existing water rights among countries. So already agreeing on the big goal of NEXUS is a big ask for the Nile Basin, right? Because that's agreeing on that big goal requires countries to have harmonized views of water, harmonized water view paradigms. This agreeing on the big goal, what is the big goal of the NEXUS, also means that countries would need to have a more or less harmonized view or harmonized policies and governance schemes across scale. We can't have a securitized, a politicized water in one sense and an economic water in another sense and a public good water in another sense. So already agreeing on the big goal, though, like the major big goal of the NEXUS is already a big ask. So that's the first prerequisite or requisite that we need to work on if we want to realize NEXUS gains. Okay, assuming we agree on that big goal, let's say ensuring food, water, and energy security for all Nile Basin countries in the long term, what are the necessary steps that need to happen in between for us to realize that gain? And I see two major requisites, one on the governance lane and the other on the academic lane, that need to be in place for us to realize these NEXUS gains. On the academic side, I think we need to agree on a baseline threshold. Where are we starting from? What is our baseline of analysis when we want to analyze or map or model or synthesize our analysis for NEXUS gains? This is already a big question for the academic community. This is a big homework for the academic community because one thing we can be sure of for this NEXUS gain approach to have a buy-in from nations and from professionals in the basin, it can't be used as another tool to reinforce existing inequities in the systems, right? So if having that having a threshold, a baseline that is acceptable to all parties, that would be a major prerequisite, a major homework for the scientific community to even start talking about NEXUS gains. On the governance side, NEXUS by itself, by its very nature, requires a very high level of collaboration, high level of data sharing, high level of trust, and collaboration among stakeholders for the NEXUS approaches to be successfully implemented. We know this is markedly missing on the Nile Basin. So how do we go about that? How do we go about ensuring these the requirements for NEXUS approaches are already in place on the Nile Basin? Can we start trust building through multi-track diplomacy? Can we talk about harmonizing the views about water, across basin countries? What is the political dynamics in the basin of individual actors? What incentivizes them? And how can we make sure that these actors with very varied interests come to the playing field, right? This is not a scientific exercise. This is a governance homework. Without this in place, we can't have the possibility of ensuring our scientific approaches can be, or scientific approaches are even have a chance at success, right? Let alone realizing it. Ideally, science and governance. Ideally, there would also be that loop between science and governance in the NEXUS approach, where scientific endeavors can inform governance and policy decisions, and governance and policy requirements can further inform the scientific questions that we have. But this mix can also be stretched to science, governance, policy, politics, depending on the kind of stakeholders that we have. So all this is very varied, very diverse in the Nile Basin, and we don't have a we don't have a harmonized policies, harmonized governance system, harmonized views of water, and harmonized paradigms in the Nile Basin. So this, I think, should be a prerequisite for NEXUS Gains to be realized in the first place. Experiences from elsewhere in the world, from politicized tense river basins elsewhere, take the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Jordan, they already caution us that in areas where trust is an issue, where there is uneven, lopsided arrangements in place, where there is, what's the word I'm looking for? Where there's asymmetric cooperation, NEXUS Gains struggle. NEXUS approach struggles, and collaborative activities often fail to come to fruition. Instead, what happens is subpar or suboptimal solutions tend to be the case in basins like this, unless you work on the prerequisite activities, right? So we know these questions are these prerequisites are big asks for the Nile Basin, especially given our history, given all the tension around the water, and given all the geopolitics around the water, which are outside of the water lane. But without them, there's no public buy-in. Without them, there's no public acceptance and national acceptance to these public gains, to these NEXUS Gains. And that's also part of the reason why there's a little bit of resistance when it comes to NEXUS Gains, because they can be seen as a tool to reinforce existing inequity. So yes, there are big asks. Yes, there are big questions, big homeworks to do, but without them, we might, all our effort in trying to operationalize and flesh out the NEXUS Gains might as well be like this picture where we work so hard on the initial and the final output and just hope for a miracle in the first place. So that's my 2 cents. I really just wanted to put this governance and require the idea of requisite conditions into the discussion, and hopefully we can have a more fruitful discussion with the Q&As. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a very thought-provoking talk. So is NEXUS a water, energy, food, ecosystem health approach better than I don't know what approach? I guess I think it's good to hear about all the challenges of moving anything forward in complex transboundary river basins, and we do have a lot of those in the world, as we've also heard. I also found it interesting 200 publications already on NEXUS in the Nile, so that alone warrants a systematic review. So I think it would also be good to do that. But before we get into this kind of discussion, and please add your questions into the chat box, we will hear from our, in the Q&A box, we will hear from our 2 discussants, and I'd like to introduce our first discussant, Professor Yazir Mohammed. He's associate professor currently of hydrology and water resources management at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. And he talks to us from the Sennar Dam infrastructure. The dam was actually on Professor Bashir's slide. So yeah, directly from Sudan. And I hope he can, tell us a little bit from his own decades of experience about, what, from what you've heard, those two presentations and your own insights, how can we draft and craft more impactful integrated solutions, from a modeling perspective, from a governance and trust building perspective. So over to you, Professor Yazir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. I hope internet will save me to be stable to say a few words. I will start with my comments from the second presentations because it gives the framework, and then I zoom into the first presentation of Muhammad because it is a kind of an application to that wicked problem. I like the two presentations very much, and I think it adds to the knowledge in the region. My comments to the first presentation of Magdalawit, she has correctly described the complexity of the problem of the Nile, linking biophysics, hydrology, water, geopolitics, economics, environment, name it, everything. But she ended up with questions. I hoped if she could have highlighted some kind of lines of moving forward. But from my side, I would like to give some proposals of moving forward, hopefully useful. I think she correctly described the complexity of the issue, especially when it links to the political instabilities in the region. We all know our region is very much politically unstable. I mean, we for example, now in my own country, now we have a very severe war. In Ethiopia is also not stable. In the Horn of Africa, this has direct implications on the welfare of the people. Now the question is, how can water, food, energy be an entry point to support this political stability? I think that's a key question. And in that, what I am thinking of is that if you can show some benefits for the people, if you show some benefits of the people of Ethiopia, or some benefits of the people of Sudan, or some benefit of the people of Egypt. Now I focus my talk for the Eastern Nile, because the Nile is too big. If you can show some benefits of cooperation to the people, coming from water, coming from energy, coming from food, coming from trades, coming from movement of people, coming from everything, that could be an entry point to a better political or better geopolitics in the region. Now, what academia can do is that, of course, academia can provide a lot of knowledge, but ultimately it is a political system who can accept or who can adopt this knowledge. An entry point to define what are the benefits is to simplify the system. For example, the Nile is too big, 11 countries, different hydrologies in the equatorial lakes, in the Eastern Nile. So why not to take subsystems of the Nile? Eastern Nile could be subsystem. Equatorial lakes could be one system. Lake Victoria, for example. Baro, Akobo, Sobat between Ethiopia and South Sudan could be subsystem. And try to build from these subsystems and to grow to the bigger Nile basin. That is relatively easier. One. Number two, it's much easier to enlarge the pie than limiting to, okay, water, food, energy. But if we take, for example, Sudan, Ethiopia, or Sudan, Egypt, or Egypt, Ethiopia, there is much more benefits from cooperation than these three: food, energy, water, nexus. Moving to the second presentation of Muhammad Bashir, I think it is very nice. But my question is about the modeling approach. It's good you make an infrastructure model, which is, I think, is a river basin simulation model to assess irrigation, hydropower. But I was surprised to use daily time step because it's too fine for this kind of computation. It doesn't fit the water balance. I mean, if you travel from TK5, Takaze 5 to the border, it's already 500 kilometers. If you do it with daily time step, the water balance will not fit. And you can do it with course of time step, 10-day time step, monthly time step. And it's good to start bringing the economical computation is, because that's what's really needed to convince the political arena or the political stakeholders of the benefits. But it is also important to look into the economy beyond these three parameters: water, food, energy. I mentioned that economy can be much bigger benefits from cooperation. If there is no cooperation, for example, like the situation right now, there is no agreement on the GERD, for example. There is no data exchange between the GERD and Roseris. So all what has been described as potential benefits, in fact, they are actually risk, because the dam operator at Roseris, close to GERD, is very much cautious to operate the dam for the safety of the dam itself, not to capture the benefit. So I just summarize my input is that it's very much needed kind of contribution from this nexus. Very well describes the problem, and it is time to think of the future, but to simplify the approach to the future, step by step, simplify the system. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your great insights and also, making it clear that if we do not cooperate and work together, any additional infrastructure, might lead to worse outcomes than without the infrastructure. I think that's very, very important, very good. And we're now moving to our second panelist, Dr. Binyam Yop. He's a senior policy advisor in the Strategy and Policy Division in the Feed the Future Office of Policy Analysis and Engagement in the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security of USAID. Binyam, over to you. Same question, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to contribute thoughts on this very important topic. Transboundary rivers, especially the Nile Basin, was a focus topic of my PhD thesis during 2005-06 to 2011. I believe I met Dr. Yasir Mohammed actually in Addis during 2009 as I presented on my topic research on benefits sharing. I'm a student of Aaron Wolf from Oregon State University. So he gave me a lot of perspective similar to what he did right now. So I benefited a lot. So it's good to meet you again after so many years. Although the Nile is not the subject of my focus at work at USAID, I have been following the progress in my personal capacity. The work presented here is really interesting and very relevant, especially as we are dealing with increasing challenges such as climate change, droughts, flooding, population pressure, and the impact of economic development and more. As Professor Bashir concluded, although the models presented have inherent limitations, they can still help us to identify policies, institutions, and technologies that can take advantage of the opportunities, for example, enhanced food security and reduce negative impacts of some populations, example, flood, drought, inequity, and so on. PhD candidate Mgdelawi's focus on components such as trust building and harmonizing water paradigms and good governance are very critical issues that we need to have in order to have sustainable and equitable achievements. From my experiences working at USAID, I'd like to highlight two flagships that hopefully are of interest to the topic area. The first one is I'll put a little bit on the chat also the links to what I will be talking about, is the U.S. Government's global food security strategy that has 3 objectives. One is inclusive and sustainable agricultural-led economic growth. And second is strengthening resilience among people and systems. And third is a well-nourished population, especially among women and children. So one of the things you can focus on, for example, is a lot of the shocks that we'll face due to climate and everything, the resilience, how to increase efforts to sustainably lift communities from entrenched poverty and combat intense shocks and stresses on that aspect. So if it's of interest, I'd like to point that out for if it's of interest to the presenters as well as to the attendees. There is more interest deeper, if you go deeper to the global food security strategy, there are a lot of guidelines that we put on a website called AgriLinks. So we have resources such as I'll put a link here on improved water resource management for agricultural systems. We have resources on how we deal with climate smart agriculture and systems. We have again a very important topic of interest to the NEXUS. We also have what we call the natural resources management for improved water resource management for agricultural systems. So, so especially the topic of improved water resource management might be of interest to the presenters here, where we focus on government institutions, where both presenters have talked about on-farm water management and sustainable irrigation, but also on market and farm inputs and private sector engagement, which relates, I believe, to what, for example, Professor Bashir was talking about, the brick building business that might suffer. So might be of interest there. And I'll be remiss if I don't add the policy issues also. So we do have actually a guideline on how we talked about policy systems, and I'll put a link here to address that, where as Magdalawit has discussed, we need to create a prioritized policy agenda. We also need to create institutional architecture systems that can actually help implement it. And then also, this might be of interest, maybe the presenters, I don't think you have addressed it, is accountability. How do you make sure that there are mutual accountability processes to help build that trust and harmony and everything that you've been talking about? The second flagship I would like to point out is the U.S. Global Water Strategy. And this particular might be of interest. This is my last link that I'll put there. It has 4 strategies that you can view. One is on strengthening sector governance, financing, institutional markets, where without finance, I don't think you can achieve many things. So considering how finance fits within your work might be of interest. Second is on increasing equitable access to safe, sustainable, and climate resilience water and sanitation services, and the adoption of keen hygiene behaviors, because part of the water that will be used for irrigation and everything that you're planning will be also used for drinking and other aspects that might be of interest. Third is on improving climate resilient conservation and management of freshwater resource and associated ecosystems. So that's something you might want to look at. And last but not least, the 4th objective is to anticipate and reduce conflict and fragility related to the water, as all Professor Yasir Mohammed, Professor Bashir, and PhD candidate Magdalawit have discussed. That's all I have for the moment for you. I know we can discuss this for a long time. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to learning from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Binyam. I think good to know that the U.S. government is strongly invested and is, very supportive of policy and also investments in improved water resources management. Has understood the the urgency of doing better in the water sector and has put forward both guidance documents and I think also investments. So we come now to the Q&A portion of the section, and it's great that everyone has their camera on. And I'll bundle the questions, I think starting with our two presenters. Also, if you do have questions to the panelists, feel free to still add them in the Q&A. But I'll start with a series of questions that were put to Professor Bashir, and he might have heard additional questions from Professor Yassir that I might have missed. So, but there are two questions, at least, no, actually three, that directly link to the modeling framework. Professor Yassir is surprised that you use a daily time step to run the model. Proclegese would like to understand what steps you took to reduce, mitigate data uncertainties and how they affect calibration and validation. And Thomas Sahinkuye, I probably don't pronounce your name well. He would like to know to what extent the modeling tools that you have used are both calibrated and validated. And then Mohammed El-Bashir would like to know, if you showed a bunch of impacts that you did model, and is it, the selection, is it linked to data availability? I think you already said that's correct, but it's still good to clarify that further. Also, maybe what are future steps? What other impacts do you plan to model? And again, what do you think? I guess is affects the impacts. Like which impacts play the biggest role in Sudan? I think that's also an interesting question going beyond the modeling on its own. Another modeling question from Brian Bruns on, if you have considered to alter the reservoir operation rules to maybe address maybe the brick making or in actually to consider, reducing potential other environmental impacts. And we have also a comment from Birhanu asking if this brick making ever was a sustainable practice, because I guess the idea is that the sediments come from the Ethiopian highlands. Has it ever been a sustainable practice? I mean, I guess as long as these sediments come down, it's hard to see why not use them for something. I think that's a very substantial number of questions already there. And so over to you, Bashir, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ringler. Many questions. I hope I can remember all of them. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Yasser Mohammed, for the feedback and the very insightful comments. I think I will start from the daily time step selection. So the idea was to try to select a time step that works with the river basin model and the hydrodynamic model. That's why we need to look at a finer temporal resolution. But in terms of distances and lag times, that was part of the model. The model, different reaches in the model, they have time lag for the flow to travel from one point to the next, and that was added to the model to consider together with the fine temporal resolution. And of course, the hydrodynamic model, it's a two-dimensional model that uses the diffusion equation, and in that way, it considers travel time within the simulation processes. Certainly agree that economic cooperation offers more opportunities, and I remember, during my PhD when I had 3 economy models for Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and I had the water system connected to all of these economy models. Of course, you can look at the impacts that are coming from water, energy, and food systems, but as soon as you connect these economy models through trade, for example, all the impacts coming from water, energy, and food systems look like just noise in the performance. So definitely, economic cooperation offers more promising pathways for trade and for economic integration within the region. Yes, data sharing is very important. The underlying assumption in our simulations is that there is at least the lowest level of cooperation in the Nile Basin, which is sharing data. We didn't go to even further to look at operations coordination of dams, but our assumption is that at least the the operators of reserves dam would know how much water is coming in. But otherwise, I agree with you. All of these opportunities might not even materialize if there's no data sharing. Then to the other sets of impacts, to the other set of questions. So uncertainties, how we try to address the uncertainties in models. Of course, one of the things that we try to do always is to go through the standard model calibration and validation processes to try and have some confidence in the models. We did that with the river basin model. So we looked at how, you know, a historical extended period of time, which is I think 30 years. We try to calibrate and validate the model. We adjust a lot of parameters to make sure that the model works properly and can reproduce the past, such as lag time, for example, for river flows. But again, there are other parameters, for example, in CGE models, in economy models, there are so many elasticities that one needs to estimate to be able to run an economy model. And these are normally, there are values out there for developing economies like Sudan, but still there is a level of uncertainty there that needs to be addressed through sensitivity analysis, and it needs to be communicated clearly before the data can be used. So other impacts that needs to be selected. Yes. So the question was whether why has these impacts been selected specifically because of data availability, and our plans in the future is to go further and try to include as many of these as possible and integrate them into the simulation framework. Which impact plays a big role? Energy is always very important in developing countries. Any shocks in economy models on the energy sector would produce a much larger impact than shock in agriculture or so. So I would say the hydropower sector here, specifically in this analysis, had the bigger impact in terms of economic performance. Did we alter reservoir routes? No. So for the GERD and all the dams in Sudan, we relied on previous studies that optimized the operations of these dams, for example, published by Kevin Wheeler and others. And we adopted these operations, assuming that each country will try to operate their dams in a way that maximizes their benefits. Consider other environmental impacts. Of course, yeah, this is something that we'll look at in the future. And is traditional fire clear brick production a sustainable practice? So I agree with Dr. Ringler's response there. I mean, as long as you have the sediment coming down the stream, you can practice that that industry. But again, there are other studies that show that brick production itself is not environmentally friendly, because in the process you need to cut down trees and there's a burning of trees, there's greenhouse gas emissions. So there's the other side, that other side as well. So from an environmental sustainability viewpoint, it might not be a positive industry. I think I covered pretty much everything. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And you can also, type answers to additional questions that are in the Q&A. Over to Magdalena. So there was a question, I mean, your questions are somewhat more difficult. The first one, I think from Birhanu is the Nexus approach different from a systems approach? So, and then the other question, where is the person? Susmina, I think at Jarrell, I probably pronounced that for sure wrong. She wanted to know if harmonized policies, I think, are different from, but what is a harmonized policies and how does that link to a Nexus approach? And I think Professor Yassir, had focused on the importance of economic benefits, like to show there's real benefit streams. It's not like there's a quantity of water that changes. I think that's, maybe not so interesting for people, but if they say, okay, we produce more food or there's more, income generated, which is why these economic modeling tools, I think, are increasingly used. So that's a bit more easy to grasp and then can be directly linked to investments. And I think what he's also tried to say, and I think Dr. Job as well, is that, if you take this broader approach, you can, for example, generate energy security benefits or food security benefits, and they might have less tension than just talking about water going there and water, not coming down. So taking this broader approach of Nexus might actually help cooperation rather than hinder cooperation. So yeah, if you could quickly, reflect on these points.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for the comments. I do appreciate Dr. Yassir's comment. I did end on a question sort of intentionally to sort of spark this discussion. But partly also because I don't have the answers to these questions. I have, and I agree with some of the recommendations Dr. Yassir mentioned. Suboptimal solutions might be a possible way forward to develop trust. We're starting the collaborative work on a sub-basin level, on a bilateral country level. These are all feasible options, and I completely agree with that. I also agree that these modeling approaches and economic development approaches, these are absolutely necessary. That could also actually be part of how the governance systems can evolve because the way I see it, as long as we show the incentives, as long as we show what's possible, that could be a very good incentive depending on the political economy and what incentivizes different stakeholders. That could be a very good input. So I wholeheartedly support the development of these modeling programs and economic development models. They are necessary in order to operationalize the nexus. I just don't want the governance side of it to be forgotten, as it does in scientific discussions most times. For the question, is the nexus approach different from systems approach? In my mind, they're not. The way I think about it, the nexus approach actually capitalizes or embodies the systems thinking approach to, like I mentioned earlier, to identify interlinkages, to identify interdependencies between the system, to identify feedback, and actually capitalizes on those feedbacks and synergies to maximize benefits. So in my mind, nexus thinking and systems thinking are not desperate paradigms, but one feeds into another. The other question was about harmonized policies. The way I use harmonized policies across scales is not similar policies between the countries, but at least compatible policies across scales, across countries, across the basin, right? Experiences from other river basins show us that if this is not in place, nexus approaches, regardless of their feasibility on paper and on models, is not applicable. Europe is a big example, for example, in the Rhine, the cleaning of the Rhine River Basin, which is actually a great example of a nexus approach where you actually capitalize on river gains, ecosystem gains, and also political and tourism gains, right? So part of the reason why those projects were very successful was that the ICPDR, also the same case in the Danube, these river basin organizations were able to harmonize policies at the supranational level, at the European level, even at the country level. So it's in that sense that I use harmonized policies and harmonized governance schemes, because nexus approaches are rarely limited to a country. They are possible, but in the sense of a transboundary water management, they have to cross boundaries. So there has to be at least a compatible policy approach among countries, which is, in my mind, a requisite for realizing nexus gains. I think those are all the questions for me, right?
Yeah, no, these are, and we've obviously, made a little dent, I guess, a further dent into the complexity of the Eastern Nile Basin water, energy, food, ecosystem health challenge question, or wicked problem, as Mr. Lavid has posited it. And we are about to close, but I want to hear from every panelist and presenter, one very quick, one sentence, one question. The question is, what is the one next step, researchers should do to move things forward on water solutions in the Eastern Nile? One sentence, one very quick answer. Professor Yassir, I'm starting with you.
Thank you. One sentence: try to prove benefits of cooperation for all.
Okay, perfect. Binyam Yop, over to you. One sentence. I like that length from Professor Yassir.
Create mutual accountability for the benefits that will be gained through Yassir Arafat's comment.
Okay, excellent. Mohammed Bashir, please, over to you.
Yeah, I think I would just echo Professor Yassir's earlier comment that Nexus should be implemented at several scales.
Okay, yes, the scale approach, that was also very great. And Magdalavit, last but not least, please.
I would say looking at water management, not just from a very sectoral or technical lens, but including the governance and the management aspects of it, because of that's pretty important. It makes or breaks a water management scheme. So.
Okay, perfect. I hope you all learned something. I learned a lot. And thanks again to panelists and to presenters, I think, for this stimulating discussion. And as a reminder, our next webinar in July will focus on the food biodiversity climate nexus. So another challenging topic, focusing, I think, zooming in more on the biodiversity side. Not Eastern Nile as far as I know, but we'll let you know more about the geography. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us here today. And goodbye.